Well, hi all. Greetings to you from sunny Brisbane. I'm finally getting around to getting back to you guys and answering some of the questions that you sent me, the questions that I've received from the study groups, and I apologize for having not gotten back to you earlier with some of the answers to these questions. It's taken me a little bit of time to get back into my real life after having spent so much time in Romans, and then it's then taken me some time to get back into the headspace of Romans in the last few days so that I can answer your questions. So I appreciate these questions. There's quite a few of them, and I'm not sure that I'm going to answer them well in a lot of detail, and maybe that's a good thing. What I think I'll try and do is break this up into a couple of different sections and maybe a couple of different sessions. And I think this time I'm going to start by answering some of your questions on methodology. And then we'll maybe talk a little bit more about some of the content in Romans 8 that you had questions about. But let me begin by just trying to describe to you some of the methodology that I used as I was preparing for these talks. One of the questions was, how long do you normally spend preparing talks? And in this case, this situation was very unusual because I really spent all of 2020 in COVID lockdown working on Romans, and that was very unusual and in some ways overwhelming because so much to get a handle on, but a good thing because in Romans it's a very profoundly deep book. You could spend your whole life working in Romans, and so to have the opportunity to really be focused with not much else going on in my life at all. So it was me and COVID lockdown and Romans, and so I spent a lot of time thinking about this passage, thinking about Romans, and then thinking, of course, about how Romans fits into the whole of redemptive history and the redemptive revelation. So methodologically, you asked me, did I use the same central idea method that you guys have been using in the study groups? And yes, it was actually really, really helpful to me to be able to use that methodology. And I started primarily asking the question about what do we learn about God in this passage, which is the Women in the Word methodology. Let's start by learning about who God is and what he's done in this passage, and let that be the controlling way of looking at the passage. And by doing that, that took me then to the end of Romans 8 about the love of God. Nothing can separate us from the love of God, which is Paul's massive conclusion at the end of Romans 8. So that was then the focus of what I was doing with these talks. How does this passage in Romans 8 teach us about the love of God? Which made me step back away from the passage in the sense of looking at what the passage teaches us about who God is and what he's done, and then fitting the information, the details of Romans 8 back through that lens. And you might notice that what I ended up doing was breaking the passage up thematically into what does the passage teach us about what God has done in terms of his love, the first talk. The second talk was about God's love expressed through Jesus and the sending of Jesus, and then God's love expressed through the sending of the Holy Spirit was the third talk. So in that sense, I didn't go through the passage verse by verse. I came at the whole passage 3 times through the different lens, first of God's love, and then God's love expressed by him, by the Son, and by the Holy Spirit. So in that way, I was coming at the passage from a thematic, through a thematic lens. and that was how I worked. That was how I worked through the passage. How did I go about doing all of that? Well, the talk that Kim gave about working through a passage and how to work through a passage really was the same way that I worked through this passage. I kept reading the passage through the lens of the love of God, and then I kept reading the whole of Romans through the love of God, and coming at it from that theme all the time, rereading over and over and over, going back into the rest of Romans to explain a lot of what was going on in Romans 8. Now, Romans 8 is also the conclusion, his big, massive conclusion at the end of having worked through all of that theology up to Romans 8. And so in that way it was good, because it was already a summary statement, and I could take the summary statement and go back through the midst of Romans and ask, how is he building the summary statement through the first 7 chapters? So in a lot of ways I was reading Romans backwards. I read a book about reading Romans backwards, starting at the application, the practical application in the end of Romans, and reading the theological pieces through the light of the application at the end of Romans. And in a way, I was doing that with Romans 8 as well. I was reading the rest of Romans through the application that was there in the end of Romans 8. So methodologically, I didn't go through the passage consecutively, verse by verse. Although I think in some ways, the passage actually did break down that way, so that I ended up really going through the passage, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and the passage sort of worked that way a little bit, even in the way that the passage is constructed. Okay, so methodologically, reading Romans 8 and then reading it back through the context of the whole of Romans, that was the main thing. I kept going back every time I had a question in Romans 8, maybe about interpreting a particular theme or word. I went back into Romans and read Romans 8. I outlined a lot of Romans 8 to try and get the flow of the argument, especially to understand major concepts. Now, I did make a couple of major interpretive decisions, and that was based on reading the commentaries, which was a very essential part of preparation here, because Romans, of course, is a difficult book, and it has some very major theological concepts in it, and I wanted to make sure I got them right, that I was standing on the shoulders of orthodox interpretation, and so I needed to know what the commentaries said about it, and that helped me make some very important interpretive choices. I think the one that you probably two big interpretive choices. One, the choice of sin being a force, and that came from the commentators who have, of course, investigated this for centuries. So I'm standing on their shoulders at this point. That sin, that Paul is using sin here not as behavior, but as a controlling power. Now that helped me, just that idea helped me then go back and read the rest of Romans, and help me interpret what was happening in Romans 8. And then the concept of slavery was the other big controlling theme or metaphor. And again, I saw that in the commentaries as they were talking about slavery, and then of course the idea of slavery being connected back to Exodus and slavery and the freedom of Israel out of Egypt. So those two concepts of of the nature of sin and the controlling power of slavery, those two things were very helpful interpretive grids through which I then interpreted the passage. And that was a decision that I made coming out of having read the commentaries, and that was an important part. And so then you asked me about using the idea of the mafia boss, and what I tried to do a lot in these talks was you asked me a question about illustrations, and I tried to use illustrations that were actually biblical illustrations, because I think that's what Paul is doing a lot, not only in Romans but in a lot of his writing. He is illustrating his theological concepts by going back into the history of Israel and using the history of Israel as the illustration of what this means. So understanding Israel's history, understanding the role of these major events in Israel's history, primarily the Exodus, is the main illustration of what Paul is talking about in much of Romans and in Romans 8. And so he's building on those things. So at the beginning of the second talk, I talked about Abraham, and that again was an illustration, and that's an illustration that came from Paul himself. So I tried to use illustrations that actually came not just from Israel's history, but the illustrations that Paul uses, and understanding that that's where he is getting his applications from, out of the illustrations in history. Yeah, so methodologically, I read and reread, I outlined a lot of the book. I read commentaries to help me make major interpretive decisions about which direction I was going to go, how I was going to tackle particular parts of the chapter. And then I did quite a bit of, I suppose you could say, word studies, where I looked at concepts, the concept of law, the concept of sin, death, the body, the physical body. In Romans, I read Romans. I read the whole book just looking for content about the law, or just looking for content about sin, or so I kept going back through and rereading, and then I would go into Bible Gateway and I would track every time Paul uses a particular word in Romans and try and figure out how he would use a particular word. And I'll actually come back to that in answering another question later on. But you asked me why I prefer the Old Testament, and part of the reason that I prefer the Old Testament, or I like studying the Old Testament, is because it's so full of the stories that form the background to our New Testament interpretation. And so the narrative, the illustrations, the pictures, the metaphors that are there already established in the Old Testament then help us to understand the pictures and the metaphors and the theological concepts in the New Testament. Okay, let me move on from here. And now, methodologically, the fact that my controlling idea, my central idea, was the love of God, the transformative love of God, was a very helpful thing to me as I interpreted Romans 8, because it prevented me from going into all kinds of, because I'm limited in 3 talks. I have 3 talks, and I cannot cover the entire theological world in 3 talks. I have to make interpretive decisions about what I'm going to include and what I'm not going to include. And because I decided that the love of God, the transformative love of God the Father was was the way that I was going to interpret this passage. That actually helped me to decide not to include certain things. And so for some of you who are familiar with Romans and Romans 8, you will notice that in my 3 talks there is a lot of things that I did not talk about. And I struggled with some of that, because the theme of the law is a significant theme in Romans, and the relationship between Jew and Gentile is a significant theme in Romans. And I could have spent a lot of time talking about the role of the law, which Paul does in Romans. But I decided not to, because I was controlled much more by a central idea that was exploring God, who God is and what he's done and why he's done it and what that tells us about who he is. So that was a very deliberate methodological and interpretive choice on my part. And it was helpful, because it really helped me keep, every time I was going, oh, I should talk about this, I was able to say, no, I don't have the time, I don't have the space, and I want my central idea to control where I'm going with my interpretation.